We have launched.
Yes, we have. Welcome, everybody. Planet Green Trees. That's what you're listening to. It's officially episode 162. We're calling it The Assault on the Michigan Dispensaries. Today is August 22nd, 2013. Call numbers 1-347-326-9626. I'm your host, Michael Comorn, and to join me tonight to bring only the best in medical cannabis reform and medical or marijuana and cannabis reform, Chad from the Rant Compassion Club.
Good evening. It's nice to be here.
Jamie Lowell, Third Coast Compassion Center.
Hello.
And producer and responsible for all guests and all of the timely, informative information that we've been bringing to you every week, 162 weeks plus. So thank you, Jamie. Anyone with any complaints, lodge those with Jamie. Of course, from the Compassion Chronicles, Editor-in-Chief, Rick Thompson.
Go Lions.
Football season already. All right, so tonight we will be talking about recent developments in the medical cannabis community. We'll be discussing the recent rash of dispensary raids in localities where these establishments have been licensed and functioning for years without any issues, without any complaints, without any nuisance complaints. Joining us to engage in this discussion will be the Executive Director of the National Organization for Americans for Safe Access, Steph Sherer. She'll be talking about these raids and the need, why they're needed, and some ways potentially why these, how these establishments can be prepared for when they are raided. I know ASA has long been supportive of raid preparedness, and I think have a number of different periodicals and manuals to assist in that. We're going to get her to talk about that a little bit so people can be better prepared if and when that's going to happen. And I really think it really goes across the board. The key is being prepared in all these situations when you're engaging with cannabis or medical cannabis at all. So it's going to be discussing and touching on some of the recent developments regarding the federal rescheduling of cannabis efforts that have been initiated by ASA and now headed to the U.S. Supreme Court. We're also going to be getting updates on Michigan POWs or victims of the war on drugs, Jerry Duval, who is awaiting word on possible medical release from prison by family members, Tracey, Bowen, Duval, and Ashley Duval. We're also going to hear from the co-founder of the Home of Medicine and president of the Ann Arbor Medical Cannabis Guild, Mark Passerini, who recently visited another prisoner of war or victim of the system, Ryan Basore, who is in federal prison. Ryan, of course, was one of the Lansing Seven who, despite compliance with state law, was sentenced to the mandatory minimums in federal court and caught up in what was an overlap of federal and state law. And interesting would be one of the individuals who would be on the other side of the recent Holder announcements in terms of how the U.S. Attorney's Office is going to be exercising their authority and what crimes are going to be charged in eliminating the plant count. Ryan Basore and the Lansing 7 didn't have that benefit and is now sitting in a federal prison, and we're waiting his return. Mark will be letting us know how Ryan is faring in confinement, how things are developing in Illinois for medical marijuana. That's where his the facility is, and I understand it. As we know, Illinois was 20th state to pass medical marijuana, and there was recently a there was an event that took place, kind of opening remarks and introduction to the community. So we're going to hear about that from Mark. Also, our weekly installment of the court report from Steve Green of the Human Solutions. Contributions for tonight's show: Rick Thompson, Compassion Chronicles, Jamie Lowell, Third Coast Compassion. I'm going to rant in a little while. We're going to talk more about current events and, of course, the news from Rick. Tonight's show is sponsored by Comorn Law, 1-800-656-3557. Also, the Michigan Medical Marijuana Association, MichiganMedicalMarijuana.org. Thank you to all the moderators, administrators that volunteer their time to make the forums at that location. Website, safe, comfortable, assisting in the evolution of the discussion about cannabis reform and medical cannabis. Give a shout out to our good friend Kevin Spittler of the Ostemo, Michigan. Also the Marijuana Rancher and the Marijuana Ranch Cultural Center. Tours are being accepted. Call to book your time now, 313-422-5281. I want to give a shout out to one of our declared gold standard certification centers, Green Light Clinic, our friend Dr. Kumar Singh, who will provide for you a compliant post-April 2013 amendment of the Michigan Medical Marijuana bona fide relationship, your certification. Expect to go back for follow-up and expect to communicate with him over the 2-year period of time, but he will come to court and testify for you, so we appreciate the willingness and commitment of Dr. Singh. All right, so there's a lot to talk about every week. There's always so much going on. We've got an exciting show. We're going to be talking about some of the events as they've hit home. It's like last week, especially in light of the announcements last week and some of the good news that had taken place, the Holder announcement. And, of course, last week was in the venue of the recent Sanjay Gupta announcement on CNN. So last week was a show that we had a lot of optimism. We were talking about the Grass Lake decriminalization event with Representative Shirkey and Representative Irwin. We had one of the representatives from Lepon, Jim Garrick, who's a wonderful representative of why marijuana reform has got to take place. It's the only thing that makes sense. But I'm going to rant a little bit about the recent rulings. You know, this past couple of weeks, the U.S. federal judge overturned the state law in New York of the stop and frisk. Stop and frisk has been a policy that the mayor and others in favor of this type of policy, and have cited it as a reason by which the crime has gone down. A lot of statistical analysis that's taken place in this regard. And the concept here is that if the policy is in place and people who are walking in a neighborhood are aware of the fact that they may be stopped and frisked, that they are going to proactively not carry guns, and then there's going to be less crime. And therefore, things are going to be a safer place. But the fact is that these problems still exist, and the statistics I don't think are actually reflective of what's really going on in these circumstances. In light of last week's Attorney General Eric Holder's announcement that the Justice Department will keep nonviolent small-scale drug sellers who have no links to criminal organizations from getting caught in the mandatory minimum sentence trap. And, of course, we talk about this, and some of our guests tonight are what we're going to be talking about are victims of those mandatory minimums where the judge has no discretion at all in terms of what kind of sentence they can offer. But in light of the announcement, one of the principles that was identified was that the prison populations are out of control and the costs are mushrooming to the point where it's nearly impossible to keep up with. America has more people behind bars than any other country in the world, and Holder's instructed his assistants in the U.S. Attorney's Office across the country to evade mandatory minimum laws by not specifying drug quantities when they are charged qualifying suspects. He also wants alternatives to prisons pursued when possible, meaning you might find house arrest or tethers is a different way in which you would decrease the overpopulation of the prison community. And while it's good news that some people would have faced long prison sentences, and we talked a lot about this last week, and then as we talk about it, our show is designed around the prisoners of war and the war on drugs who are still in custody under those, what was not that long ago and still draconian, nonsensical, failed policy. But there's always concerns when the executive branch acts unilaterally and it writes its own law. And this kind of brings us back to this policy that has been not only criticized but overturned of the New York City stop and frisk policy, under which the police can stop, pat down, question anyone on the street who arouses suspicion. A highly, highly subjective criterion indeed. The federal judge in this case was Shira Shendlin. She ruled that the New York Police Department carries out the policy in a manner that violates the Fourth Amendment rights of blacks and Hispanics. The judge specified the ways that the city could fix the policy and appointed a monitor to keep an eye on the police. In light of this ruling, the news in the city of Detroit is that the new police chief has employed the same policy. So while one federal judge out of the New York district has declared this to be unconstitutional and cited the violations of the Fourth Amendment, specifically for the individuals who are being stopped and frisked. The Black and Hispanic community, the city of Detroit, employed the exact same policy. Both these horrendous policies are to be tweaked to make them less egregious, is ultimately what the judge had ruled, but this will not be satisfactory. The police will still have the arbitrary power to stop people walking down the street, and the federal judge will still put some people away with long mandatory minimum prison sentences, regardless of the particulars in the case. In other words, they're deeply flawed policies, deeply flawed. Yet even this would fall short of what's needed. The problem purportedly addressed by the stop and frisk and mandatory minimums are of the government's own making. What does that mean? That means that we're here talking about stop and frisk and mandatory minimums because the government acted to create these things. The fact that they exist and that they are problems, that they're causing overcrowding, and that a judge has to rule that specific persons living in these communities are having their Fourth Amendment constitutional rights violated are exclusively the fault of the government's laws and the government's policies. The stop and frisk specifically is largely aimed at finding youths who carry guns and drugs. Mandatory minimums are directed at drug dealers, drug sellers. It's not hard to see what is at the root: drug prohibition. When government declares certain drugs illegal, those drugs just don't disappear. Instead, they move to the black market, which tends to be dominated by people skilled in the use of violence. So the whole point is here that the need for stop frisk policy is developed, comes out of the failed war on drugs and the failed prohibition policy. Because when it exists, you're inevitably going to have black markets that are going to sell it, and this is the violent area in which things take place. The need for stop and frisk is directly born of the failed policy of prohibition and the black markets that have developed and are dominating these markets. Because the trade is illegal and the courts are off limits for dispute resolutions, contracts and turfs will be protected by force. And the need for guns, therefore, exists and are used in a illegal manner by those who are not following the laws for those possession and ownership. Those who operate in the streets will find it wise to be armed. That's part of the nature of the black market. So as a result of prohibition and its attendant violence-prone black market, in some parts of town, a percentage of young men will likely be walking around with guns and drugs. Seeing this, politicians and law enforcement bureaucrats turn to a stop and frisk and mandatory minimum sentences. Be mindful of the fact that in federal court, in addition to your mandatory minimums for some of these drug crimes, if you have a gun, it will double. Maybe look at another 15 years to run consecutive, depending on your priors. And at the end of the day, this policy does nothing but create more overcrowding, greater prison population, sucking more and more resources out of what's already a poorly managed economic system by the federal and state governments. What's most disturbing is that the whole focus here is on merely putting a Band-Aid on what is a festering infection, because there's still as many guns on the street. Just the people that are having them are more wise. By giving a upfront notice and policy that these kind of things are going to take place, they may not be carrying on, but that doesn't mean they're not going to be available. And people aren't worried about being stopped and frisked when they're on their way to do a hit and lick and rob somebody or pull a carjacking or break into a house. Those aren't things that are going through the minds of criminals. What's further is this. Anytime you start hearing bureaucrats, legislatures ignoring the root of the problem, creating solutions that involve the suspension of civil liberties or clearly defined constitutional rights at the federal and state level, you should pause. This is something that's going on our borders, something that's going on in airports. Every time there's a threat or a fear of some terrorist act, people are subject to the suspension of civil liberties. We saw it in the Boston bombing. I tried to encourage communities to remain calm and not get in a panic mode where individuals are just all of a sudden going to be tossed aside. And the question really is, why are these things in existence in the first place? If you look at the root of the problem and some of the policies that have been employed by the federal government, maybe some of these fear levels and policies that have been developed or needed to, or seemingly, whether they're needed to or not, I guess is really the debate, but whether or not the direction and how we're going to be reacting to them is justified can and should only be examined in light of the root problem that brought it to be. I guess what I'm getting at to wrap this up is that at the end of the day, we still live in a situation where despite the federal potential for reform at the sentencing level, mandatory minimums, and at the discretion of the U.S. attorneys to charge crimes that don't involve plant counts or weight, there really needs to be a look at the reform to these crimes and come up with a policy that better suits the communities and looks at a way in which we can stop wasting the resources of the prison population and get away from concepts that as we are locking people up and denying them of their freedoms, we're going to suspend the freedoms that the free people have to stop and frisk and investigate. It's a failed policy, and as a free country or so-called free country, it's imperative that we not lose sight of founding principles that we're all entitled to as citizens of this country. All right, so that's my rant. We're going to take a break and be back with the most entertaining medical cannabis radio in the country. We'll be right back.